is a whole stack of different stuff.
There's just a bunch of different stuff. Yeah. Hey, everybody. How's it going?
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about contrary motion counterpoint on the guitar. All right, so my name's Kurt. Is this in the way, this mic thing? I feel like it's...
Whatever's good for you,
All right.
man. Yeah, you can see me.
Okay, very good. So, yeah, thanks so much for being here. So this is a talk about this thing that has been of interest to me for like the past maybe 5-6 years. I've gotten really into this idea of contrary motion counterpoint within the context of atonal or dissonant music. And so all these concepts are simple, and they don't really get more difficult. Like I don't necessarily think of them as interesting from a cultural theoretical perspective or a political perspective or an aesthetic perspective. But I do like the sounds, or I should say I like some of the sounds. And I guess part of what seemed interesting to me to talk about was the process or the practice, which is something I don't hear talked about too much, which is that part of being an experimental musician where you have kind of phase one, which is sort of generate a bunch of materials, and then maybe phases 2 to X, where you do things with those materials. But I feel like a lot of the times, pedagogy especially, or presentations, just kind of assume that you either stumbled upon something that was cool right when you find it, and then you were immediately able to do it, or usually you heard somebody else do it and then you tried to do it. But to me, experimental music is largely the question of having some ideas or having some thoughts that something might be interesting, and then developing a procedure of some sort to try to generate some things, and then hopefully separated in time, in many different instances, you might revisit them or look into them and then see what they are, if they're anything, if you like them, if you hate them. And that part, I guess, I do think is a little radical, I guess, in the sense because I think it does separate people from the question from taste, which I think is kind of an important part of the experimental music heritage, getting your practice away from any immediate considerations of whether good or bad, or if you like it or you don't like it, or even, weird normal, because some of this stuff you plot out, you say, okay, I'm going to go from a perfect fourth, and then I'm going to contrary motion, so we end up with a perfect fifth, and then we're going to end up with a sixth. That's three chromatic notes. They should be weird, sound really normal. There's nothing particularly exciting about that. So you might say, oh, that's going to sound incredible, and then it just sounds like pretty normal. Contrary motion's been a part of Western music for a long time, and there's a lot of dissonance in Bach and beyond. So that's another kind of question: is what are we looking for? And then the other question, which I think would not be weird to ask if you were working with Macs or with analog synthesizers, but is somewhat taboo in a way when you're talking about a guitar, is how do you do it? Like, what are the actual moves you have to do to make a Max patch or to make a modular synthesizer patch that goes from X to Y? That's, I think, a very kosher question. Talking about like all of the sub-menus of effects pedals is a very kosher question, as I understand it in experimental. But talking about like what do you do with your fingers if you want to experiment, if you want to see what those sound like, I feel like that is seen as absolutely off limits. That you should never say that we're going to talk about the technical question of where notes are on a guitar and what our fingers can do and what we might want our fingers to do that they can't do yet. And I'm sort of curious about that. I sort of wonder why that is. I understand that talking about sort of guitar thing or instrumental things is dorky. I understand that in a broad sense. But in terms of musician to musician or talking to one another, I'd be interested in discussing that. And so I guess I should say, so at the start of my practice, and it hasn't really evolved beyond that, I just really did get interested in the idea of contrary motion. It seemed like the best kind of motion. It seemed more interesting than the others. I know that, in Mick Goodrig's book, he talks about counterpoint as involving several kinds of motion. There's parallel motion, where you're moving intervals at the same time. There's similar motion, intervals at different sort of melodic rates, but basically in the same direction at the same time. There's what's the one where you have one? oblique motion, you've got one voice is going to stay consistent, the other voices, and then your final one is parallel, where both voices are going to move in different directions. It seemed like that was always kind of the best sound. And so from there, I started trying to do some experiments. I guess the first place I should start, I studied a lot. I continue to study, but I haven't taken a lesson in a while, with a guy named Steve Herbermann, who's a really great jazz guitar player, who is one of the people in the world who has spent the most time working on the guitar style of George Van Epps. He's like a 7-string guitarist from the swing era who did a lot of intriguing contrapuntal guitar music, often with like very, very, very hyper-focused attention to like kind of where the fingers are on the strings and where the he wrote 3 books, which are incredible books, actually quite weird. And so I worked with Steve on those, and also on some standards and ballads and stuff, arranging those. So not talking about that. But so from Steve, you sort of learned about this tradition. Who are the people who in the past have kind of done work on this? One of them, of course, is Van Epps. One of them is kind of Jimmy Weibel, who was a Western swing guitarist who became a kind of a modernist jazz guitarist in LA, who wrote a couple of books that were all sort of like kind of like interested in sort of within the kind of classical language possibilities for contrary motion, and those are really important. And then there's country guitarists like Jerry Reed and Chet Atkins do a lot of contrary motion stuff as part of their kind of like fancy licks. And then obviously I think contrary motion, I don't know the literature of people like Ben Monder and stuff as well as I probably should, but I know that it's a big part of the kind of modern guitar thing. Bill Frisell, Ben Monder, that whole school. So one of the things that I sort of came out of studying with Steve, though I don't think he didn't suggest it directly, but it sort of seemed like a Steve thing, was to think about stations. So we're talking here about the chromatic scale. To start with, we're going to just try and move chromatic scales around and see if we can contrary motionify them. So thinking about a station as maybe like that's one place you find some of the chromatic scale, and it has a certain kind of fingering, and it enables access to certain other kinds of notes, and then it disables access to most other kind of notes. The question is sort of, what would it mean if we could really concretize this so we didn't have to think about it? What if we just knew that as not so much kind of A to D as a chromatic scale, but just as kind of like figure 1 or something, or even a pedal, like a distortion pedal, so we're going to press on that. What if we then wanted to add on like what if we wanted to add on a whole tone scale descending from D, and let's say we're going to go at a ratio of 2 to 1. So when we were talking about counterpoint, there's concerted counterpoint, which is a lot of what I go into in the materials I generate, because concerted counterpoint is hard. It's really hard. It's very hard to improvise. It's very hard to even play notated, because there's no gaps. Every time an attack happens, 2 voices are moving, and it's quite punishing. In a lot of Baroque music, a lot of contrapuntal music, the ratio is 2 to 1, and that seems to be a lot more forgiving. So in this case, if we went like, and then we could even sort of take it down a little farther. So that's using our station, and then using on top a whole tone scale together. One more time. And so that was like the first thing I came up with. I thought that's really kind of nice. That's that's something I hadn't played before and hadn't really heard before. And then like another thing I did was like that same station but just backwards, and then an ascending diminished scale on top, and trying to put them together. That also sounded interesting to me, and so that was a kind of a a big phase of this research was just with these stations. Like, so another station I came up with was this one. Just a little bit of the chromatic scale there. And then thought about, for example, putting a diminished scale below, which would be like... There's just like a little rhythmic variation. One of the things I was discovering as I was doing this is that obviously it'd be very interesting to do this work kind of with a very sophisticated polyrhythmic thing, but even without one, you know, sometimes it's just a question of staggering a little bit, or just kind of being a little bit, just sounds a little more like music. And again, so some more of the station stuff, like a station here, and then to me is a really interesting sound. Now it has a lot of technical challenges, which again might not be very interesting to the non-guitarist, but maybe in terms of your own practice, maybe you could think of some parallels or something. That, for example, if you start with an interval like a perfect fourth, in this part of the guitar, you only have sort of 3 notes you can play before you have to move your hand. Similarly, when you are raising, if you raise one more, you're going to be in a stretch that might not be very good. So then you start thinking about the fact that you have like an open string here. So you sort of try to start figuring out where open strings are that can kind of help you out, you know. What happened just there, I had to do a switch of position because if I was going to keep going down like that, I'd be in an awkward position. And now as we get farther, you can tell that's it's harder to do that full thing without clams. And that's because the way the guitar is built is just like these big intervals are kind of things we almost never do. And it's also, they're so weird in a way. The things that like I find I so rarely am dealing with those sounds by themselves. I'm not even sure I like them yet. You know, I don't really know how I feel about them, but they are a thing that I've encountered by doing this kind of work. Here's like another one, and here, for example, we start thinking about grace notes. For example, like one thing that makes the thing a little easier to play would be just not pick every note. And then maybe if you start hammering notes, it actually starts sounding a little more interesting. So you can hammer notes, you can stagger the entry, you can slide a note. And here, when we reach a certain point, we're just going to flip directions. One's ascending, one voice is ascending, and then it's going to go back down. And then one voice is going to descend, and then it's going to ascend. And again, the ratio is 2-to-1, so altogether it's like... once more. And then there's these interesting things happen where all of a sudden you're finding yourself on an interval you weren't expected to be on, like you start ending on this kind of odd perfect fourth, which is really nice. Another kind of variation on that sort of thing. And then let's play you a few more of these things. So here's another place, perfect example, we're countering a difficult thing on the guitar, to play 3 and 4, play G and G sharp, or A flat on the low E string, and hold down an F sharp, or G flat on the top. So, you know, that becomes, to me, a very interesting kind of problem solving, of like, is that the way to do it? Maybe. Seems like it's kind of working, so maybe some combination of grace notes. Now my hands are kind of finding these things because I've done them a lot. You know, my success ratio is probably about 65% or something. So that's part of also how I work with them now, is now that I've generated these. So one of the things you're talking about is that there's kind of taboo for some reason about talking about the about process and procedure in experimental music, guitar or no guitar, about how there's kind of a first stage, I think, for a lot of us where we generate material. We have a question, we have an idea, we get a new piece of gear, and all of a sudden we're writing stuff down in our notebook, just trying to say, what's every setting on this pedal? Or like, what's every permutation of this chord type that I've never played before? And then at some point, hopefully, like, this seems like ideal to me. At some point, we would have that material and we'd revisit, and we would revisit it a lot, and without trying to make it good or interesting or avant-garde, just to kind of see where it is. And so I guess that's the kind of thing I encourage when I teach, like that kind of attitude. And it is very, all of you who teach, I'm sure, know this. It's a very weird thing to suggest to students, and they're very resistant to it. The idea that you might spend years on some guitar research or musical research that may or may not pan out, and that may or may not have anything to do with the records they're listening to or the gigs they're playing. And that's weird. It's weird. It's a weird thing to do, kind of in capitalism, But I do think it's kind of how we all make music, And so, on the guitar, sometimes that means, let's say, on the bus, it's very easy. I do a ton of stuff with Guitar Pro on the bus, just kind of mapping voices on my phone, two-line voices. But the question then of how we actually play it when we play it is a really important thing. So then, part two for me might be a lot of pencil marks on a paper in terms of slide, finger, picking out directions, and I think that is really important. That's really important. So none of it, and I sort of proceed from the idea that nothing's unplayable. So it's really just a question of finding the thing, to play. And it's also being open to surprises. So like a lot of stuff here, for whatever reason, has been low. I guess a lot of the guitar is low, but then sort of encountering like up here, all of a sudden it starts sounding different to me. It also allows you to use these open strings in ways that are very weird, that are not typical open string things. So like, so here I'm going, this is coming down. And this is, no, this is interesting. This is actually a kind of parallel motion. Both voices are going down. So it's also kind of important to break both rules. So here we're using an open string, though. This would be the normal way to do A down to F sharp or G flat. Here I'm choosing to use an open G string because it enables something else. What it enables is a hand shift. It also enables a little more sustain. Again, it's not every time. And then here, instead of going just down the fretboard, we're going to go down, 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 and then an open string. And that string is ringing. Well, this happens. And that's actually a really nice cluster. And that's the other thing that I think has been a interesting thing about this kind of project, is that my improvising guitar life sort of began, it remains sort of in conversation, in a reverent conversation with Derek Bailey, the music of Derek Bailey. And Derek Bailey's music is, nothing is more known as being sort of like clusterland than Derek Bailey. These big Derek chords. That he got from Weber and other places, just also kind of messing around. One of the people I'm in a lot of conversation with is my friend Henry Kaiser, who is really kind of a student of Derek's and a collaborator, and we've talked a lot about our love of Derek. We've talked a lot about the problem of Derek clones, that the Derek clone syndrome is a problem. It's not true to the thing he was about. He hated it. There was a guy in Canada, in Toronto, actually, who was like the major guy who did this, guy Lloyd Garber, who published books of basically Derek's private materials. Eric Cheneau studied with him. he used to have an ad in the back of Now magazine that was like, "Come play with Lloyd Garber, Derek Bailey style," which as a kid was a surprise. that was a career. But anyways, Derek didn't like that. I think it's one of the reasons Derek didn't teach. I mean, after Lloyd took lessons with him, probably on a grant, Derek stopped teaching. So the Derek clone thing is a big thing. So I think one of the, and Henry always talks about, like, guitarists always sound the same. Like, this is a guitarist problem. It's not, you don't find it with, I know that I'm sure saxophone players, there's people who everybody sounds like for a while and then they sound like somebody different. But I can tell local sax players or local trumpet players, I can tell apart in a few seconds, and there are maybe 20 to 30 local guitar players who are great, who I don't know that I would be able to pick off a record. And it's not an insult. I might be one of them in certain cases, but we all sound the same. You know? And so part of the reason to do this work is that it's nice to not sound the same. It's nice to have as an intention not sounding like every other guitar player. Yeah, that's another thing I think would be very heretical to say in a class with a guitar student. You know, it's like don't sound like everybody. It's bad. Is it bad? I don't know. Maybe it's fine. But there are reasons not to. You know, I think if it's just conventional or something, then I guess the reason not to is that I enjoy hearing people who don't sound like everybody else. So if we like that, we have to do that too. I guess that's the socialism of it all. Here's some other things that are kind of contrary motion, kind of in the same world, aren't exactly the thing that I've sort of settled on is the thing I really want to investigate is how long can I make these contramotion phrases? You know, because if you start even at a unison one way, that's how far you can take a unison this way, right? So that's not very far. And if you start going in the opposite direction, well, how far can you go? Okay, we're down to here. So now we're at E. Now we're going up to. Then we're going to go to. That's about as far as you can go without doing something, tapping or using harmonics or something. So, which is actually pretty far, you know. But that would be a very slow lick to play on a gig. You know, that would not be the satisfying musical event. Might be, maybe it would be it, but not all the time. So the question is, how do you develop materials where you can do that a little faster or something? And I have to say that what I've come up to compositionally is the idea that this stuff, for me, will probably be stuff that I play notated, like that. The musical situations that are best for this are ones where I've had a lot of preparation so that I can play the stuff, and maybe have the improvising be done by other people, because like halfway good contrary motion guitar doesn't seem very interesting to me. So to be really good, it might have to be a thing where I approach that as I'm the person playing kind of the fixed stuff in a group. So another thought I had at certain points was that because we can use open strings and stop frets together in sort of creative ways, like this, for example, to play minor second. It's like play ostinato that only requires one finger. That's already immediately that kind of stuff is kind of that's kind of cool. And then what if the figure is sort of like just add one more thing to it, so it's not quite so simple. That was kind of nice. That one's nice too. Again. Kind of like these lower ones have something kind of mysterious about them. Sort of variation. So that's a sort of way, I guess, a very long-winded way to get back to Derek Bailey, which is like, I think those are things that Derek Bailey would have liked. I think those are sort of, they're dissonant, they don't suggest any key, they don't suggest any genre, they don't suggest any historical information. They're kind of pure slabs of dissonance. But he was not a fingerstyle player. He played with a pick. He was not a contrapuntal player particularly. So that seemed like kind of a cool. So some other things from that same page. Again, getting sort of lower, it's just some interest there. I don't know what, like sort of what for. Once again. All I know about that is I haven't played it before. It's new to me. It's kind of interesting, and so that's again something that I probably wrote out like 5 years ago and have returned to from time to time. I probably have changed where notes are on the guitar a half dozen times in Sibelius or Guitar Pro, and then that's where it is. And then to make it into what it's going to be, if it's ever a thing that comes out in music. It's sort of an open question. Sort of an open question even for today, like, about which I'd love your input. What do you hear? I've been hearing lately that the thing that would really please me would be to have like a third line played by a different instrument. And that's why I've brought Brodie here today, is to sort of maybe do some playing towards that. That 2 lines are cool, but 3 lines are really cool. And in theory, with the bass player, 4 lines is kind of a thing that I correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like in improvised music particularly, there isn't that much of. There's, we don't hear that very much. We hear still a lot of, I think, adherence to kind of a jazz model where there's a harmony that's indicated by a chord chart of some sort at the top of a bar, and then players kind of filling in, kind of from that. But counterpoint, I feel like, is less of a thing. So and here's some more of those, just kind of like on that line. And here we have something like. Which I like. I think there's something kind of intriguing about that. I'll stop. Are there any questions so far about this, or why we're here, or yeah?
I have a question. I feel like in seeing you do this, it's like this isn't something I've worked on very much, or at all really. But I would have thought that I would think about it like similar to chord voicings, where I have some things that use open strings and I have some more movable shapes. But it seems like perhaps because of the scale length of the guitar and the reaches involved, maybe everything is very specific here.
That's what I've been finding. Yeah, that's what I've been finding, that the movable shapes, what guitarists would call grips.
Yeah.
And grips are really important. And I think grips in improvisation are really important too, even in free improvisation. Like I think having the muscle memory and the knowledge of kind of where things live, that you could transpose, that you could say, oh, I could play here, I could play there. I'm finding with this stuff, not so much. Yeah, that almost immediately. So this is some stuff, I thought I'd take a page of, instead of stuff that was just 100% research, here's some stuff I wrote down that I thought was like was inspo. I was inspired. I thought, I'll write this down. And it's like this. Transposable, like it has to do with these notes can be found here, then there's the fact of the open string being there means I can play that, and and then the fact that again, my fingers can reach there. Yeah, Alex.
Oh, I'm not cutting off the question or anything, am I?
Not at all. No.
So I'm just having been someone who has done a good amount of composing through the process and stuff like that. I do find that there's a very different, I guess, kind of like gesture or step that kind of comes with, there's the way that you wrote the thing and the method that you used to assemble it, and then there's what you learn about it in terms of improvising and stuff. And so it gets me kind of interested in how you're composing with this very rigorous, like conceptual thing, and it sounds fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
But I'm also kind of curious about, like, does a composition just end up being kind of that one schema? And if not, how do you bridge the gap between some of the textures if you're using multiple different chromatic assemblies for that?
It's such a good question. I mean, so I have experimented with just trying to hear the chord progression that comes out of any of these things, and which is always a baseline, right? I mean, I think that's So and sometimes that really suggests itself, and then we're sort of in the realm of something like, I don't know, Paul Bley or Cecil Taylor, or like, I feel like piano music from the avant-garde jazz era, where those parts of Cecil Taylor where there's compositions, where the sort of, so the idea is that somehow it all ends up back as some kind of ballad, or it all ends up as some sort of sweet tune of some sort, ornette as well, which I think is one of the qualities of American avant-garde jazz, is that it actually, there is a necessary, actually like kind of a crucial relationship to sort of things that are sentimental or things that are popular in certain ways. And so, and I guess this would also be a place where my friendship with Martin Arnold would probably be really paramount in terms of how I think about this, because he loves things that are sappy, things that are sentimental. He loves pop music, but also I think that the way he follows his procedures and the way they end up becoming pieces is he uses this thing called the Infinity Series, which is kind of like a more rigorous and sensible version, maybe, of like the George Garzone triadic improvisation. The idea that, like, that there's some formula where if you go up a triad, first inversion, there's a bunch of notes that can't be next. So maybe you could do that note, but because you just played those two notes, you necessarily have to only play one of a few notes, maybe this one. Then that can't be next because that suggests something else that's two harmonic. So there's a bunch of formulas in the world for evading melodic predictability or some kind of regression to tertiary harmony, and so that had a huge effect. But I used to live with Martin when I was a young man, and would sort of be around when he was composing it. He's really often just sort of humming songs. Like ultimately what he wants is something he can hum, as crazy as that might seem to some of people new to his music. I feel like that's always ultimately where I feel this stuff is going. And I like a lot of harsh music. I like a lot of technical death metal. I like a lot of noise and harsh sound art music and stuff like that. But I think for this, I'm interested in prettiness in some fundamental way. Making something pretty out of this stuff that's kind of ugly. That seems like the dialectic. That seems like where things get interesting, or where it starts sounding like my music, I guess, or something that could be my music. And similarly, there are some things I'm trying to avoid. So, like, one thing I really want to avoid is this, like, I don't want to do that. That's the way a lot of guitar players play. It's the way I would have played this material at a certain time in my life, but I don't like it anymore. At this point, I just don't. I think it's really, it has a signature on it. I think that it comes, a lot of the reason to do that comes out of a kind of fear of making a mistake, with just having the electric guitar be basically an acoustic guitar, and for me, I feel the only thing I hear when I am using that sound is like a lot of trepidation and fear and tentativeness. So part of what I'm trying to do is make myself be vulnerable to making mistakes, which I will for sure with this material. But if I can get that, crispness, which again I associate with people like Ed Bickert or Johnny Smith or like the great old jazz guitar players, who were very fearless and just like kind of going for beautiful harmonies, and if you screw it up, you screw it up. But and I think the same thing is true in terms of I do know how to tap and stuff, but like I really want to resist the temptation to make all the stuff sound like King Crimson Red record, which is like one of my all-time favorite records. But I don't want it to be clever prog. Like I feel like there are other things in my life where I do like clever prog, but I think for this kind of stuff, all of it's sort of suggesting to me again towards this kind of sentimental 1950s kind of put a log in the fire sort of Johnny Smith. Like I don't know if you know the Johnny Smith record Moonlight in Vermont, but it has this like really like Laurentian pencil crayon sort of cover of like a little cabin in Vermont, and the music is so mellow and so just relaxed, and that's I just love that. That's another thing through Martin. I think I've learned there's a lot of subversion, a lot of possibility for subversion out of things that are soft, and I think like Karen.
There's two questions I have. One is with the concept of stations.
Mm-hmm.
I at first anticipated that would be kind of like a grip.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw you pick a station, and actually, depending on what the other voice was doing, you were moving hand positions a lot.
Yes.
Does that mean a station is sort of something that is heard as something consistent, but it is played in diverse ways?
Totally. It's just that that the notes can be found in a certain place, and then probably you're going to end up doing a ton of different things in terms of how you might end up getting a given note. Because I think one of the difficulties for guitar is of course that like, that's an A, open A string, that's the note that's right above it, but it takes most guitarists many years to even realize that they could do that as a move. That's how you would get from that note to that note, or, but the fact that you can do that, and the fact that you can go, that there's a G sharp there, the fact that there's a B flat there, that there's a, E flat there, and that might be a very useful thing to know, that there's, that these two notes, you might have your hand here and thus not be able to do anything up here, that if it's up here, you could add that note on top. So if I had a station that was like, let's say that's a station, D sharp, E, I might play it like this or like this or like this or like this, but what's really interesting is that all of a sudden I can put all these notes on top. That almost sounds like I have my hand in two places, which seems kind of cool. But I think when I started, I was sort of trying to think about improvising. I still think about improvising. So if I know that, for example, let's say that's part of a station, going from F sharp to A sharp. Having the idea of a station would allow me to do that much contrapuntal improvisation. Okay, I know where these notes are. So it's like I've taken some of the work off of having to remember where the low part of the notes are by kind of knowing kind of how they go together as a chromatic scale that allows me to experiment. Okay, maybe I can add another scale coming the other way as in real time, as like off the cuff, like on the fly sort of thing. These are really great questions. Thank you so much. Let's see, just going through.
I do have a second.
Oh yeah, please.
When you're doing stuff, I can understand why semitones would sort of be the default choice, because it's like it's the smallest step within this scale. When you're playing other intervals, which I've seen you done a few times, how are you selecting those?
So that's a really great question. So what I'm really trying to avoid is major scale harmony. So probably what's happening is like a lot of habituation over a few years or a lifetime, I guess, of working on this stuff, of sort of knowing which combinations of notes are going to sound too much like major scale music. And sometimes you get it right. The other thing I'm always trying to avoid is unisons, which are not really bad. But I feel like if I hear too much of that, it starts sounding like something for some reason, it's like.
Does it like tonicize?
I think it tonicizes, and I think it also somehow it stops the motion in its tracks. All of a sudden, it's stalling for a little bit, this might be a good time to talk about this other exercise. This is one that I stole from a guitarist named Tim Miller, was one of the students of Mick Goodrick, who's another major figure, I think, in learning his stuff about trying to think about the guitar in this way. He wrote these really magnificent books on guitar harmony, and are very unusual, and that also require a lot of deviation from like the things you learn as just kind of a normie guitarist. But it's funny, his books are like almost entirely about major scales and melodic minor normal scales. So maybe part of it was also trying to apply some of that stuff with a little bit of less knowability in terms of this. So Tim Miller has this exercise that's like the 3-note exercise where you start with any 3 notes, and then you keep one note constant, and you move the others 2 in contrary motion, either a half step or a whole step. So like one version of this would be like. One version of that I did one day, but this is kind of a thing where, for example, we could easily have our first choice here would be, let's see, to move, keep the low voice constant, move the high voice down one step, and the low voice up one, or the middle voice up one step, which would be right, which would be to what would sound to me like a B7 chord, or and that's, so I avoid that. Like whenever I do this exercise, I would always avoid going, and I would always avoid going, let's see, like, where would be in this case, like, let's see, I guess from this chord it's actually hard to get to a really normal chord, but the idea is that any of these exercises, which in theory, you know, like in Mick Goodrick's books, are always being done around knowing how to get through modal harmony with different kinds of permutations, can be done atonally, or can be done with just, and I guess that brings me to the whole dissonant counterpoint thing, which I'm not a musicologist by any means, but as far as I understand, that term, when it was created by Charles Seeger and Ruth Crawford Seeger and Henry Cowell in that moment, was just that idea, basically, that it was no more sophisticated really than the idea of what if we did counterpoint, but it was never major scale harmony, if it was always ugly, as it were, and that to me is really interesting, and that's what if one could be creating sort of experimental chromatic music without any more of conceit than let's just not have it sound like major scale music, and so far that's been kind of working pretty well. if you take scales if you send notes in opposite directions, if you send them flying out, you can avoid having to have much more of an apparatus than that. I think that's kind of the hope. Are there any other questions? All right, so I feel like let me just play one more. So this is just kind of like another kind of sheet of exercises. And that's kind of like one thing that's kind of interesting is to really go from these sort of very crunchy close intervals and then to sort of get really wide. So that's a kind of movement. There's obviously, you know, some interruption here and there in the math of it all, but mostly consistent. So that's kind of fascinating. Some of the guitar things that are kind of that happen, like for example, sort of talk to the guitarist later about this if this is interesting, but that's kind of a move that you don't do very often. So like, you know, from this shape to 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 this shape, just kind of feels good in the hand, you know. Why don't I? Yeah.
Question, if you don't mind. Do you, in terms of like maintaining the direction of these lines, do octave jumps just not seem viable? Do they disrupt it too much to you?
No, I don't think they would, and I think they would actually be really cool. And like thinking about someone like Cecil Taylor, thinking about some of the inspiration for it, a lot of those piano players are very octavey, you know, or Eric Dolphy, you know. So I think I probably should do more of that, you know. And part of it is just that it's kind of hard to. It's kind of like someone's in any position. Now, when I play harmonic, sometimes, you know, there's more of an opportunity for that, like, you know, like, this amp is very buzzy on the, so we won't worry about that. But, you know, obviously you could do that. But why don't I have, at this point, why don't I have Brodie join me, and let's try to do a little bit of improvisation around this, some of these pieces. Let me just call up. Yeah, everybody know Brodie? Brodie West, the great, the incredible. All right, let's look at this document here. So I did write out some melodies, and so for example, on top of this thing, I sort of had that idea maybe of like something in that world is kind of like basically kind of an A minor, a little bit of A minor. Yeah, so that's. But why don't you sort of like play around with it a little bit, sort of see how it is, and then maybe after a minute or two, we can maybe say like, let's do a piece, and then we'll do a short piece. Yeah. kind of. So how did that feel, Brodie, as a obviously not like how mind blowing was that improvisation, but what as a melodicist, like.
It feels like open, but I was conscious of like I really liked your motivation to not sound, because you said like major scale,
Right.
But I sort of interpreted that as minor scale.
Yeah.
Any scale, any key center is kind of like or it could be or just like not one or many at the same time instead of not one or something. So I was like deliberately trying to not. I found myself playing like I don't know, like somehow trying to avoid that, but it sounded successfully not.
Yeah.
Other than that, I was maybe playing an E.
Right. But yeah, it's a kind of interesting thing because there is also the thing with chords. I think this is something a lot of guitarists have been into recently for whatever reason. But if you take two pretty things, if you take like let's see, like part of an F chord and a part of an E chord, and you put them together, you end up with like an interestingly ugly chord. So it may also be the case that if you take, let's say, a descending whole tone scale and a chromatic scale at once, and then you say play lyrically in A minor, well, you end up with something intriguingly ugly, even despite the fact that one part of the assemblage is not following the rule of being out. So what about that? What if you were to just play A minor, and I was going to play some of this material? Let's see how that sounds, I guess.
Okay.
Sounds kind of great.
It's
sort of interesting how that works. Yeah.
So it's not that it's not that I need to avoid playing what would be diatonically or anything. But I guess
but I feel
always
like
a balance of things. Like
you're not playing like the George Michael saxophone. So you're not playing.
No. Well, we could try that.
What's that song? Should have known better than to cheat a friend.
It always
Careless
comes
Whisper.
back to Careless.
Yeah. But yeah, I think because I think what
avoid it. No, but or it's like in the context of what you're doing too, like like I could also think a little bit the same way. Like if I still find myself not being able to really play fully diatonic without feeling like I want to add something that's a little bit different, like chromatic or whatever.
Now, how about this one? For this one, maybe I'll play a loop of one of the figures, and then maybe like kind of you can come in at some point when you feel like you kind of have a sense of what that texture is, and then play for 2-3 minutes or something. Thank you very much. So yeah, yes, Andrew.
I'd be curious. Maybe this is like the whole kind of like combining something very diatonic with something that is not, and then as a listener not really feeling that sort of diatonicism.
Yeah.
I would be curious, like, because I would imagine that as a listener, if the diatonic voice or entity was like the lower voice or the grounding voice, there'd be more of a tendency for like the ear to to that. At least that's what I would like anticipate or think of. So if you had like a ground, whether it's a bass line or whether it's two lower voices that are very diatonic and then something else on top, I feel like it'd be way easier to feel like it's two major scale E. But I don't know, maybe it would also depend.
Does anybody have enough piano chops to play a bass line, a diatonic bass line?
I could play low, like just a low, like
play some low.
Something,
Yeah.
Something that's just like scalar, like a little bit, just to get, like, you know, just to really see, like, to see if it starts, like what happens.
Yeah. Get the kids in. Yeah. That sounds just like slightly out, Great American Songbook harmony music. But then towards the end, I was like, it's starting to sound a little out. I don't know. What was your experience of that as listeners?
I think it seems like, there's more of a tendency to want to relate things to the lower voice. But I would definitely, as it went, I definitely felt like I was able to bounce back and forth.
On the other hand, it seems to me, maybe it's because of choosing this kind of mysterioso tempo, but it sounds monkey to me. It also sounds like monk-ish. Yeah. Maybe that's enough to... I like when things sound like monk, so that's, that's good. Monk music is not unrelated to the major scale, so,
it depends on the listener and stuff, too. I'm sure there's many listeners that would think that does not sound very...
Not very,
consonant or tonal or basic at all.
Yes, Alex.
but I definitely think it sounds more stable.
More stable,
or more familiar
Yeah.
in that world than what we needed before.
Yeah.
Or at least I felt like a lot of times I was trying to, like as a listener, I was hearing what you were doing in relation to that.
It's a great question too, because I feel like one of the things I want to try with this is to play it in a quartet with Brodie, a bass player and a drummer, and I have been sort of racking my brain what to tell the bass player, because it's sort of like bass players often are like preternaturally good at making things make sense in an improvising context, which in this case rhythmically would be a great thing, but in a harmonic sense may not be. So I've been thinking about maybe having the bass player try to play arco, maybe like her baritone harmony, like to not be a low end instrument for the head part or whatever of things. To because ultimately what I like is dense chromatic voicings. I think that if I could have basically the Mormon Tabernacle Choir all singing within a major third interval, that would be my dream music. So, but on the other hand, I do feel, and this is a little ridiculous, but that also one should seek a certain amount of alienation from your kind of priors. That maybe like going too hard, leaning too hard into the everything has to be dissonant, may be a way of failing to check oneself before wrecking oneself, or as the saying goes. Because I also thought that was really cool music, and I kind of anticipate listening to the recording later at home, being like, "Oh, that should just be one of our tunes. That's that's awesome."
Yeah, and especially like it feels like in the first one, as you're exploring that theme, there is like you are, even though there's a lot of chromaticism, it is creating this coherent thing that you could easily have destroyed that
right
very quickly.
Yeah,
it's cool. It kind of reminds me a bit, like I really liked in some of the moves you were doing in the exploration. It kind of reminded me of some stuff I've heard Brodie talk about of like micro improvisation. Like, oh yeah, you're playing with it and finding ways to interact with this free melodic voice, but you're still very much sticking to this kind of station or cell that you constructed. It's very cool.
Yeah, it's I love that, and I love that in Brodie's improvisation across the board, because it has so little of the panicked what do I do next energy that is often found in even great improvisers, but which is a vibe. It's just one of many possibilities of how you could be at an improv setting, is desperately scrambling for the next material. That's something I'm often very guilty of, but like relaxedness is such a nice quality in an improviser. I'm sorry, Alex, we got to get back to your question.
Yeah, just to kind of expand on Andrew's question. So, taking an instrument like piano, where I imagine doing this type of composition would be about as unchained as possible.
Yeah.
Just positionally and everything like that, it fits within your wingspan. But it also has the ability to switch which hand has the melody.
Yes, that's right.
You're able to, kind of put the focal point in the left hand too, with minor tweaks to presentation.
That's right.
You can do this among a band as well with like a few orchestrational choices. But I'm wondering if you could speak to how to do that solo. Like if you wanted to maybe do like Brodie's kind of melodic content, but have that as like the bass point on the solo instrument. How does that come?
No, that's really. I mean, the first thing I was thinking, which was much sort of less intelligent than where you ended up, but it's just sort of like a very technique thing. If you can sort of on a guitar go. Possible, and it's one of the really nice things about the guitar is that if you pick one note and grace note the other note, you're almost guaranteed to have the inverted thing, which is most of the time on guitar we're kind of fluffing the lower note and trying to make the melody note speak. But in terms of the more profound question, which is like about like trying to have an actual flip, that might be an opportunity where I think I'd be interested in this, where giving up the concept that the guitar is playing contrapuntally, but maybe the guitar is playing single notes, the sax is playing single notes, and we take some of these figures and we just play them as two-part melodies, which I think would be really good. And that also tracks one of the other things, which I think we all love medieval music. You know, medieval music's a lot like that. A lot of times it's sort of kind of endless two-line kind of weird melodies that, you know, and sometimes they switch, and sometimes the lower becomes the higher, sometimes the higher becomes the lower, and at the end it all kind of is a perfect fifth of some sort.
I wonder how hard it is to play single lines with the intention of not playing this like this thing of not playing too diatonically or something. How hard that is, or what kind of processing has to go on. That we don't like double, like, I mean, I think the chances are we could do that, but it also seems possible that we would. I think it would, it would definitely, more, like that it might be harder than you think, or maybe not.
Well, I think that's, I mean, I think it's and it might in fact be interesting to kind of, start in a way by trying to improvise kind of fake macho, and then try to just improvise fake macho, but with weirder notes, you know. I would almost think that would be the kind of way to go, because...
that makes sense,
But that's one of the things I was digging about our playing, was that the general vibe, which is kind of playing, sort of breathing through lines until they resolve, and then the piece is over, or then the section's over, and then you start. To me, it's a very relaxing way to make music, and it's like one of the great virtues of medieval music. I mean, I know saying medieval music as if 1,000 years of music is a concrete in all of the globe. That doesn't make any sense. I guess what I'm talking about is what the 13th century, 14th century music, 15th century music of Catholics in France. But yeah,
I was curious too, and forgive me if you mentioned this already before, or if I just didn't know this because we don't know each other like super well. But like when you're talking a lot about like. When you were talking a lot about like influences and a lot of things, you reference a lot of, say, like jazz players or quote unquote jazz, whatever, creative guitar players. And then like anytime you reference anything classical, it was more like a composer or something like that. So I was wondering, like, this is not, like, I have a couple things to add on to this. It's kind of more of an open question. But like how much of like classical guitar playing that you've done, or actually like playing like Bach fugues like arranged for guitar or things like that?
So that's a great question. Of the latter, I've done a fair bit in my practice. I'm not very good at it, but it's like part of my practice life. It's something I when I teach students, we go through Bach pieces and stuff, and so. But I need to do more of it. That's for sure. My knowledge of the classical guitar literature is really like kind of woefully inadequate. It's like one of the things that's exciting to me about having two members of the hottest modern.
Yeah, because we're so classical.
Modern notated. I know. But what's your group called? It's an awesome group. Backline. Yeah. Is that part of me is like, I'm going to show up and they're just going to tell me this is like. Oh, this is just X piece. You just spent 5 years recreating X guy's piece that like you could have ordered from the library. But
well, I'm curious about a couple of things. Sorry, if you want to finish up.
But no, so I guess I'm turning the question back to you. Are there composers who do this, like who write this kind of music, and should I check it out? Or
well, there's a couple of things that struck me that were interesting when you were talking about doing certain things or playing certain things, because like for one the kind of like multi-voice, like more than two voice thing, right? And I remember like when I was in my majors were always like composition during my degrees, but my undergrad still had to have an instrument, so it was classical guitar. So I went through a fair number of Bach, but I tried to do as much modern stuff as I could. But like I remember when I was playing a lot of Bach, like one thing they would really emphasize when you get into these kind of like really like hairy situations where you have like three voices going and you're trying to make them sound like not like a chord but like three voices, and especially when you get into like those higher positions and you have like three lines going and you have like a middle voice, and in order to do that middle voice you take advantage of one of the higher open strings, like what you were doing earlier, like you play an E flat on the D string and then you play an open E. And I remember like something, I mean, I don't know if every teacher would be like this, but I know like one thing that teachers would really emphasize would be to not emphasize the difference of the tone. 'Cause as soon as the more as you all know, like the more that you get the difference of strings, the more drastic the tone difference is. And the funny thing is, or the ironic thing is, like so much indie rock and like emo music or whatever loves that thing, and you get these kinds of cool open strings with high position chords. So like I know, like for example, when I was like playing classical guitar, if I had some sort of middle line and I was playing something on the D string, if I went to add in the open E along with that line, I would like really quickly do like a sol tasto so that you would actually mask the fact
That's awesome.
that it was an open string. And I'm not saying like anybody should do this and this kind of stuff, but one, I was curious like how much you've thought about like that kind of stuff, because that's like something that's taught in classical guitar music. And I mean it's Bach, so they're trying to be like, you know, this is not Bach.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, and the electric guitar is so different than the classical guitar, and so we don't have to do any of the real work that you all do. We don't have to keep nails. We don't, you know, we're
nails thing. What did you say?
What is sol tasto?
Oh, sol tasto. It's like when you play more over like the fingerboard or the fretboard. So like you play like natural would be like over the sound hole, the rosary. Sol pont would be like near the bridge. Sol tasto would be over. So like a sol tasto sound with finger picking would be like, well, you'd hear it on electric too. Really, you could like if you heard like it's so much rounder and bassier and smoother versus like sol pont, which is thinner and higher and stuff.
That was always the thing, because I spent a lot of time, similarly like in high school and my undergrad doing classical guitar, especially the Bach inventions.
Yeah.
A few books where they're transcribed for guitar, they're pretty great. But the thing I found was that the technique stuff didn't feel to me like it felt like the solutions on electric guitar were totally different. And also, all the classical people I talked to were not cool with my solution. It's like, oh yeah, if I'm gonna do like the open string, it's like it helps if I bend the neck when I do, which is so overused, but it helps for that sound.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh yeah, that's not like a lot of the priorities with that music were just not for the people who are like super heavy interpreters of it. Were not things that I was into. Where I was more
the reason I never
interested
stuck around it.
where it's like I'm more interested in hearing like Chris Thiele played on the mandolin and stuff, and
Yeah.
So my thing with that sort of came from country music, right? Like,
And there's also, actually I'm just remembering, because this might be of interest, I think you know this, but there's that one Bill Frisell essay that isn't contrapuntal. But it's all his fingerings for scales.
So I spent a lot of time with this kind of like with and there the thought is always about trying to get as little distinction between the notes. Try to have it just sound like one big instrument. And then also using harmonics as well. That's always been really important to me in my practice, to have that, being able to play a lot of notes in different places and trying to get them to sound good. But it really does come just from kind of banjo licks.
To me, the difference of like those tonal things is always what makes the guitar the most interesting. That's always the thing I love
exactly.
about it, right? So then, like learning to like mask that in order to like play Bach is an interesting thing.
Segovia, man, right? That's the.
The only other thing I'll say is you mentioned something, like people will come in and say like, oh, this thing already exists. The only thing I can think of in the classical world, like classical guitar world, that's like atonal counterpoint piece is I had to play this like Frank Miller piece, which I don't know any other stuff by him. It also doesn't even sound like, I think he's a German or Austrian composer, post-war. He wrote like this suite, he's not even a guitarist, he wrote this like suite for guitar, and there's like a fugue, there's like a lot of contrapuntal playing it, but it's all like basically free. I don't think it's 12-tone, but it's like free atonal.
I gotta check that out. The guy I sort of know about because he was Derek Bailey's teacher is John Duarte, who I think has some stuff that's pretty hip in terms of that. But again, when you read it, it's kind of like Barry Galbraith's chord melodies. That the jazz, like the kind of mainstream jazz studio guitarists who would do chord melodies, were doing basically the same thing as like 20th century guitarists. Let's play again, me and Brodie. Here's the kind of loop I'm going to play with. It's like a 2-line thing, like a two stab thing. I'll again maybe play it a little bit and then sort of wait. Maybe try to go for a slightly longer piece this time.
So I'll listen.
Listen a little bit, yeah. Thanks, Brodie. Beautiful playing there. And that was interesting too, because I felt like at a certain point I started feeling a certain more liberty with improvising there. Like I was able to kind of feel myself get dragged into the current and
I think I feel that too, because it's definitely like if you're doing something that's like planned in that sense, it's gonna have a different, you know,
It's-
sense.
yeah, yeah,
'Cause
yeah.
you're doing something that's prepared.
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
I'm doing, then I'm in the position of reacting more.
Yeah.
But then a little bit of giving, like
That's right.
a little bit of reacting on
Yeah.
your part, then sort of made me feel a little bit more like ambiguous as to whether you were going back to
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
You know, like I felt like a little bit of a departure made it.
Yeah. And then I'm sort of
Yeah.
discovering too that there's like a lot of difference between going, say, like, and like, you know, there's so many subtleties of staggering notes and then also layering, you know. It's what Steve Herbert, my teacher, calls sort of resultant chords. You know, if you play sort of like, you know, at the end you have this interesting chord that's all those notes are ringing out, but the listener doesn't actually hear you play a chord. It's just the result, which is really one of my favorite textures in the whole world, you know.
Or even repetition. Like
Yeah.
I found like if I was repeating the note, that seemed like something different than
Yeah.
what we were doing.
And
So-
yeah, and I was feeling the same thing too, that, you know, being able to just kind of glitch with it in like 2 or 3 beats of a bar, say, you know, gives you, you know, and then, you know, also discovering like, you know, obviously playing backwards, you know, so like if you, because I guess part of what I'm doing is trying to forecast, well, what it'll be like to play a gig with this conceit. I don't want to write 12 pages of guitar music for every song. Like, I feel like that would be counterproductive. I'd like to have 1 or 2 sheets on the music stand per piece. But I feel like one of the things that I'm learning today is also like, oh, I can think about which parts I like to play backwards, which parts I like to kind of micro loop, which parts I like to, obviously jumping around between section A and section C, or which parts seem to like open themselves up to improvisation in different ways. And then I guess we'll have some choices to make about how constrained or not the rest of the band should be, you know. So I feel like it's, at this point, I'm not such an anarchist that I think it's so bad to give people directions as long as it's consensual. But I feel like for this kind of thing where we're going for, again, sort of that Jimmy Giuffre, that early 60s kind of Inside Out thing, that like, you know, deciding tempos for every piece is really important, deciding feels for every piece, deciding length of piece, deciding maybe even orders of soloists, if that's going to be like, I feel I'd like to have a lot of rigor in terms of piece to piece, so that it's not just like faking, like free improvisers faking that they're doing something other than free improvising, you know. I guess I'd be interested in all your ideas about that, I guess, because that's more new to me, you know, the idea of like trying to have a band that's based on some of these materials. What would you do, I guess? What would be your approach if you were trying to put together a couple of sets of music? You have these reams of materials. Obviously, part of what the process is for me now is I'm going through them. I'm deciding which parts I like, which parts I don't, which parts seem generative, which parts are just too hard to play. Like at a certain point, you know, Joe Pass said he doesn't play anything hard. You know, that's like a very important rule. And you can hear at a certain point he stops playing anything hard, and his music doesn't get any worse. That's maybe better in certain ways. He just means he doesn't play anything that's going to not work. You know, like every time if you're playing like a couple of choruses after Ella Fitzgerald sings, and you know you're Carnegie Hall or whatever, you don't want to mess it up. You know, like, and so he just knew a lot of things he knew how to do that were going to sound good. And
because I talked about that a bunch with doing that Monk album live. It's like, yeah, there's a bunch of things on that I did on the album because I knew I could do them that way because I could do as many takes as I want. But
right.
now I'm going to do this show, I can't use this because I'm not going to get them even 70% of the time.
Yeah.
So.
It's funny. He's one of the another person I should talk about as a source of inspiration for this, because his book opened up a lot of things for me in terms of this practice, and very inspiring guy, Miles Okazaki, Fundamentals of Guitar. But one of the things I liked, I remember seeing an interview with him after it came out, which must have been 10 years ago or something.
Yeah.
But he said, I can't play most of the things in my book, which was really eye-opening for me. I thought, that's a cool guy who says that. A lot of things in his book are really hard to play. And they're basically just, I think a lot of it, he was at Banff, and he was just like kind of just being very thorough about all the different things you could do if you were trying to learn what the guitar was and be a guitar player. And the other thing was that you don't have to play any jazz to use this book. There's not a single reference to a standard, to blues, to anything. And I thought that was cool too. He's a jazz musician,
Yeah.
seemed pretty through and through. But
And he does Bach every Sunday. He does like a Bach
he does.
something.
Wow.
Every Sunday.
So
Stream and stuff.
Yeah, it's like his Patreon.
So I like that. I like that approach of like, developing materials that maybe you can't play for a while or that you still struggle to play, but they're either interesting you from the purpose of. I don't think like this. A lot of guitarists are like, I'd like to map every permutation of 4 notes, within an octave, playing a harmonic major scale with this stipulation or whatever. I don't. That's not interest. I get no satisfaction about having mapped every possibility of a certain thing. First of all, I don't believe that I have because I'm terrible at math, and but I also I don't. That just seems like a bad way to spend time. But like this thing, which would be more like I just want to kind of explore what moving 2 lines in opposite directions is for me, and just keep on doing it. That is interesting. That seems to me like a doable, ongoing, years-long project. And yeah.
One thing I was thinking of is just how any note, like how your ear can, like playing that way, where there's no priority of like of a center. What was the word that was said? Like
a tonic or a
tonic.
yeah.
There's no home or whatever.
Yeah.
Then you, but then as an extreme, like being able to the way we ended, I felt like was we actually somehow did.
We found that note B natural ended up being
It's almost like funny
Yeah.
because it can end like that, and just that one moment is what locks it in and makes everything seem. But